the topic of tonight's seminar. With that, so let me welcome Professor Vogel. The stage is all yours. Thank you.
I'm very honored to be one of your early speakers. And I'm sorry I'm appearing at a time when the relations with China and the United States are so tense. I wish I were appearing at a better time. I thought I would say just a few words about my background to give you a little more feel of what my perspective is. I got my PhD in sociology and psychology, and then I studied Asia after that, first going to Japan and then to China. The first time I went to China was in 1973. I had the good fortune to be chosen to be part of the first American scientific delegation from the American Academy. So I went in 1973. I went to Beida and we met Zhou Peiyuan. We also met some Red Guards, and we also had a chance to meet Zhou Enlai, that delegation. So then I came back to Harvard, and I always felt I was catching up because unlike all of you, I didn't have a chance to study in China and really get a feel as a student. So I always felt behind, but I've had a lot of good opportunities. I spent some time in Guangdong. I started out because in the 70s, we couldn't go to China, just mainland China. We could only go to Hong Kong. So I started in Hong Kong, and the best information we had was about Guangdong. So that's why I started learning about Guangdong and was at the Guangdong province in the Jingji Weiyanhui. I was attached to them for almost a year to get a feeling of the province. And then I came back, and at Harvard, I've been teaching about China and Japan. When I retired from Harvard in 2000, I tried to decide what's the most important thing to explain to Americans. And I felt the most important thing to explain was the rise of China. And from what I believed at that time, I think the biggest explanation really came during 改革开放 at the time of 1978, led by Deng Xiaoping. So I spent 10 years learning about that, and I had wonderful cooperation from Chinese friends. I got to know all three of Deng Xiaoping's daughters, and I got to know a number of other officials, and I had the very good fortune of getting very good cooperation. I stayed in Beijing mostly at that time at the Danglai Zhongguo Yanjiushuo, and one of Chen Yun's former secretary, Zhu Jiamu, was the director at that time. So that also helped me have a lot of contacts and get the background. So I feel I was very fortunate that I had good cooperation, good information, and so I spent 10 years and I wrote that book. Then after that book came out in 2010, I was trying to decide what else I want to work on. I'm a workaholic. My wife thinks I work too much and all I care about is my work. But in 2010, when I finished that, I tried to think, what's the most important thing that I could contribute? And I felt because I had friends both in China and Japan, and their relations were really at the very worst in 2010. There were some ships that bumped into each other. And as a result of that, their relationship became very tense. And so I felt that if a Chinese wrote about Japan or their relations, the Japanese might be a little suspicious. If a Japanese wrote about it, the Chinese would be suspicious. But maybe an American who was a friend of both sides and knew both sides and had written a bestseller on Japan in Japanese and a bestseller in China in Chinese, said, I might have some hope of trying to help heal the relationship. So that's why I wrote this book about China and Japan. Also in my career, another good fortune I had was from 1993 to 5, I worked in the US government. I was the National Intelligence Officer for East Asia. So I had a chance to get some sense of how governments worked. And since that time, I've taken an interest. I don't have clearances now, and I'm not a government official, but And my experience in government gave me a sense of how much information governments have and how they work. Now what I thought I'd do is spend a few minutes telling about the period as I see it, when China surpassed Japan in 2010. I could say it's 2008 to 2012. 2010, the World Bank said that the Chinese economy had passed that of Japan. In 2008, of course, because the Olympics were so successful and because of the Western financial crisis, there was a great deal of confidence in Beijing that they were going to soon surpass Japan. In 2010, their economy was bigger. And their relationships went through really a terrible period. Now, there are various explanations of why that relationship was so bad at that time. But I think underneath it was the fact that China was again surpassing Japan to be the dominant power in East Asia. When I was working on this book on China and Japan, I spent about 7-8 years before the book came out. I believe that from the year 600, but in the Sui dynasty, when the Japanese first started sending missions to China to learn about Chinese civilization, until about 838, that was a period they sent many missions in the Sui and Tang to visit Chang'an to learn about Chinese culture, that all the basis of Japanese culture came from China. But in the period of 1895 until, I would say 2010, roughly 2010, Japan had the upper hand. It was a period of from 1895, as I say, to about 115 years that Japan had the upper hand. If you start with the Sino-Japanese War, the Jiahu-Zhangzheng in 1894-95, I think in some ways that was a much bigger shock than the coming of the Opium Wars, the French and the English. If you look what happened immediately after 1895 and 1898, right away you had the year of reform. You had then you got rid of the old examination, the Kaoju system, and then the 2011 revolution. I think that the shock of Japan, that little pipsqueak of a country with 4 little islands overtaking China in the Sino-Japanese War, was just a huge shock. And I think, therefore, the impact, in a way, came much faster after that time than after the Opium Wars. And from that time, Japan imposed very heavy conditions. As you know, it occupied Taiwan, and it required huge indemnities. And it helped, after the Boxer Rebellion, keep order in Beijing. One thing, you know, my shorthand way of talking to Japanese and Chinese about how they feel about each other, is I tell my Japanese friends, you don't know how to say, I'm sorry enough. You haven't acknowledged all the horrors you've done. Individually, they will often acknowledge occasionally their speeches, but they don't do it as thoroughly as the Germans did. And they don't talk as much about the horrors of 1894-95. They don't talk about what they did in Manchuria all that much. And they don't talk that much about World War II. They do apologize, but it's often in a formal way and not far enough. So I tell my Japanese friends that they haven't learned to say, I'm sorry enough. And I tell my Chinese friends, they haven't learned down to say Japan, thank you enough. Because if you look at the period after 1895 until 1931, when the war broke out in Manchuria, in that period of time, the Chinese learned a tremendous amount from Japan. And they had so many things in all fields that they learned from Japan in that period. Of course, Sun Yat-sen went there. Kanye Wei, Liang Qiqiao, and they developed a lot of the background and work for the 1911 revolution, but they also studied in every subject. One field, of course, they learned was in the military. And not only did Chiang Kai-shek go, but in the 1930s, when they had the meetings of the Kuomintang military leaders, most of them were graduates of Japanese military academies. One of my favorites is Zhang Baili, who in 1906, in the Japanese National Military Academy, the #1 student of that academy was not a Japanese, it was Zhang Baili. And he became very friendly with the Japanese generals, and he could see that there was going to be a war, and they would invade and had higher technology and better organization, and that China would not be able to resist. So he said the only way to defeat the Japanese is a protracted war. Later, of course, Mao Zedong wrote about the protracted war, but the person who really developed that idea, the way to defeat Japan would be to wear them out. And Chiang Kai-shek took his advice, and that therefore did play a key role in the policy in which China was able to, in the end, wear out the Japanese. And from their point of view, they won the war. From the American point of view, of course, Americans think we won the war. It was through all of the bombing and the atomic bomb, and of course the Russians enter into the war. But there's no question that wearing out the Japanese played a huge role. Now, in the period of time, so I think that in that early period, the Chinese in every field had learned a tremendous, not only in military affairs, even the words like 社会主义 and 共产党, those words originally were translations from Japanese. There was a Japanese professor at Kyoto University named Kawakami Hajime, who wrote books and translated on Marxism into Japanese. And a lot of the early Chinese learned from Japanese. And of course, not only did people from the Kuomintang, but Zhou Enlai also studied in Japan. And then not only in the field of politics and learning theories about the West, of course, scientific fields and medicine, literature. I think the Chinese modern literature got an awfully big start from Japan. As you know, Lu Xun went originally to Japan to study medicine, but he ended up deciding that he wanted to write literature to wake up the country. But not only Lu Xun, but Mao Dun and Yu Dafu and many other Chinese writers, so that the modern Chinese literary movement of the 20s, I think, was overwhelmingly people from Japan. So when I say I don't think that China has done enough to say thank you, I think that's part of it. But I think also after 1978, China learned an awful lot Japan. Japan was very helpful, although they didn't give reparations, and Chiang Kai-shek had allowed them to get away without giving reparations. But they did play a role in helping out China. Deng Xiaoping was smart enough in early 78 to know that before China could really take off, they would need the help of the United States and Japan. And so in October 78, I think already he knew that at the plenum coming up in December, where it really began, he already knew before that something like that, he was going to have responsibility. So in October, he went to Japan. There were 4 things that he did there that I think already he could see the important role that they would play in Chinese development. One is he visited the Japanese steel plant at Kimitsu. And this plant at Kimitsu became the model for Baoshan. And so that before that, I visited some, when I was in China in the 70s, some old steel factories that were almost like handicraft steel factories, where I saw people shoveling coal into the furnace to make steel. And it was so different from the modern factories that they developed after Baoshan that revolutionized steelmaking. As you know now, about half the world and half the steel in the world is made in China. But at that time, there were no modern steel plants, so that was really very important. Another thing he did, he wrote on the Shinkansen. Shinkansen, as the Japanese say, the fast train. And of course, there were no fast trains at that time. Now, again, about half the fast train track in the world is in China. But Deng Xiaoping rode on the Shinkansen, and he could see that that was something that China would want to learn. He also visited Nissan, Zhichan. Nissan was an interesting company. Not only did they make automobiles, and at that time they were just introducing robots, but when Japan was in the Northeast in the 1930s, Zhichan played a very big role of Japanese industry at that time in the Northeast. So they had a root in China, but that they were a model for modern automobile industry. He also went down to Osaka, Daban, and there he met Matsushita Konosuke, Sung Xia. And at that time, of course, they didn't have computers or some of the new electronics, but they did have television, and they did have electronic calculating machines. And he wanted to learn from Sung Xia, so he met him personally, Matsushita Konosuke, and so learned about modern electronics. So in all those fields, Japan played a very key role, and JETRO played a role in getting all those things started. Well, to skip ahead now, the 2008 to 2012 period, I think that was a very shocking period for the Japanese, and it was a very tense period. I think a lot of the Chinese, and this is an American perspective, and maybe not every Chinese would agree, but I think there was an excitement about the new power. It's in a way analogous, I thought, to a nouveau riche, that people who suddenly became rich get very excited. And I think that a lot of the Chinese felt for so long we've had to bow down to the Japanese, and now we don't have to bow down anymore. And so the Japanese went through quite a tough period, I think, from 2008 to 2012. By about 2014-16, China decided they better stabilize relationship. And of course, China has still sent ships and airplanes to the Senkaku Diaoyudao area. And in that area, things are still quite tense. But I think that in a way, that worst period of tension between China and Japan has already passed. I think it was in that period from 2008 to 2014, before things began to stabilize. The situation is still tense. I think if Xi Jinping were able to go to Japan, as we hoped he would this year, if it had not been for coronavirus, I think that relations would be distinctly improved. But even without that trip, I think that relations with China and Japan, they're not happy relations. The people in both countries do not have very positive feelings. They're mostly negative feelings. But it's not as tense and not as hostile. The Japanese are readier to be polite and not to say the nasty kind of things that Trump and his administration say about China. So I think in that situation, we have a situation where China surpassed Japan, went through a tense period in the transition, and things smoothed off. Now, the way I see what's happening now with the United States is a much tougher and more complicated situation. As you know, Americans are very confident. And I think after World War II, once the Cold War with the Soviet Union was over and the Soviet Union fell apart in early 1990s, and Eastern European fell apart, then the only power really in the world was the United States. And I think the United States was arrogant at that time. I think, fortunately, Nixon and Kissinger, at the time when they were forming relations, when Kissinger first went in 71 and then Nixon went in 72, I think they saw China as an ally against the Soviet Union and China as a friend who might help get rid of the Vietnam problem for the United States. So I think there was a strategic reason, but I think that also there was a willingness to try to help China modernize. And I think when Deng Xiaoping came to power in 1978, he realized how important education was. He'd been in France from 1920 to 1925. And even though he could not afford to attend a university, he could see that being there and absorbing the culture and learning how a modern country did it could be very helpful to people who Zhou Enlai was there at the time, Ye Rongzhen, Chen Yi were there. There were a lot of Chinese who were there who later came back to play a very important role, realized that foreign learning was very important to develop. And the United States was quite proud and confident and felt that we could afford to help out another country. So I think that the United States during that time period was really quite generous. And when Chinese went back to China and started forming factories, when Deng Xiaoping allowed private enterprises to start first the Getihu and then later the bigger enterprises and allowed them to develop. I think Americans felt that that was an opportunity. And when China began to build factories, it took a while to get up to quality. And they were learning from the Japanese as well as from the Americans. I remember in the 1980s when I was in Guangdong, going to some factories and they had big signs which Guanli, the urban Guanli, they were studying Japanese management practices and they were modernizing on the basis of what they were learning from Japan. But they, of course, they were also learning from the United States. And I think at that time, there were a lot of people who were quite happy with the results of American investment in China and China's growth of industry because it was providing work opportunities for Chinese. It was providing opportunities for young scientists and engineers and managers to learn from foreign companies. And of course, American companies were making money too. American financiers were investing. I think, I don't want to get too deep into America's problems, but I think America did not go from the industrialization era into the service era very well. I don't think our national policies were very wise. I think that when we moved to the service economy, we were too much interested in helping the shareholder, the stockholder, not the person, not the shareholder, the person who owns stock but make a lot of money. But we didn't find enough way to spread the wealth more equally. At the industrial period, I think we had a more equal distribution of wages and our society was healthier at that time, and that our transition to the service sector was not nearly as successful. But I think with our relation with China in those early years, because we were investing in Chinese industry, our companies were doing well, and the American consumer gained. I think at the time, the American political leaders in Washington didn't realize the adjustment that was required from the worker, and they didn't realize how bad it was going to be for society to have so many people in the working sector who had formerly worked for a regular job in a factory, and suddenly as a service worker working part-time without any regular compensation, without any Social Security, and with wages that were too different from those of us who had a better life in the United States. So when I try to understand what happened when Trump got elected, I think that's part of the background, that it was the United States did not manage that process well. And that we had so many people who felt that they were not taken into consideration when the big political leaders and the rich people in Wall Street were making money. And I think that's the background of why Trump rose. I think at Harvard, if I say are there any people I know at Harvard who support Trump? There may be some, but I don't personally know them. I think it's that one-sided. I think among the students and the faculty, they feel he's been the worst president we've ever had. He's taken us out of the international field. He hasn't handled the coronavirus well. He likes to pretend that he has good relation with a top leader in various countries, even with Kim Jong-un in North Korea, and he pretends he has a good relation with Xi Jinping. But I think that he doesn't rely on experts. He doesn't have a sound policy, and he has made things very worse. I think the trade war has turned out to be very disappointing for the United States. There's some good articles, I think, have come out recently by specialists in the United States. There's one named Ryan Haas, who just has an article examining the results of Trump's policy toward China. It's been terrible for the United States, as well as terrible for the relationships between China and the United States. Now, on the question of why the relationships came so bad, in a way, I think it's a natural competition. China has done well, and China is a competitor. But in the United States, as you know, when we have sports teams, we in the Red Sox and the Boston Red Sox have a rivalry with the Yankees, but there are rules about how it's done, and there's a good sportsmanship. And we congratulate the winner, and we don't have such a nasty feeling of hatred toward the other side. But I think in China, it's now developed, and I think it's gotten worse because a lot of politicians have mismanaged the relationships. But I think there, of course, as you know, there are some underlying issues. China is now very competitive, and in a lot of industries now, the United States is not as strong as it was. There's also a feeling that China has not played fairly, that we have been an open society, and that we have rules about how you take intellectual property from somebody else. But China has taken a lot of intellectual property there without following rules, or even if recently there are courts that rule on this, they don't make the payment so large that it really hurts the company who is taken. And as you know, there were a lot of American companies that set up factories that had in China, where you had a Chinese manager who, after a few years, formed his own company that was competitive with the American company. So from the point of view of the American company, they took the secrets that we had developed that over a longer period of time with a lot of money, and they were using to compete against us. So I think in addition to the success of China, it's a feeling that that was not entirely done fairly, and that the opportunity is not fair. And then, as you know, in the United States, in the last couple decades, well, I would say clear back to the Nixon period, if you had issues coming up with China, I think there were two groups of Americans that supported good relations with China. One were business groups, and the other were intellectuals and people who had intellectual exchanges. And both were doing pretty well. But in the last few years, even though some American businesses have still stayed in China and are still doing well and making money, I think the general feeling of businessmen is that there's not as much money to be made, that the Chinese are now that they're able to compete in a lot of sectors, they're being very tough on American firms, and that the state enterprises and the government often decides in China in favor of Chinese firms and not the Americans. So from the point of view of a lot of American businessmen, it's not just that China is successful, it's that they're not playing fair. And for Americans, fair play is very important. And so there is a feeling among businessmen, and they can complain that China is not competing fairly. Among many intellectuals, of course, the fact is that now China in the last several years has gotten much tighter. And our intellectual friends in China used to be more open, are not now so open. And the strictures on what you can say are much tighter. And that the open intellectual environment that had begun to develop under people like Hu Yaobang are not there under Xi Jinping. And so the American intellectuals now, particularly since coronavirus, of course, we don't have opportunities to deal with Chinese intellectuals. I'm happy to say that a small number of us still have intellectual friends in China that we do communicate with and do communicate with fairly regularly. We Americans feel that our Chinese friends are being a little cautious in what they say. They don't want to speak quite as frankly as they could a few years ago, and that inhibits our intellectual exchange. But I think as a whole, the American scholars who have studied China still want very much to have good relations with China, and are very sorry that we can't, and are very critical of our government, as well as they're critical of the crackdown in China. But it is a situation of much tighter relationships. Also, as you know, in journalism, the American journalists have been much under tight control. You probably know that the person at the White House now is in charge of Chinese studies as Matt Pottinger. And Matt Pottinger, I happen to know him. I'm not a close personal friend, but I do know him. He was a Wall Street Journal correspondent, and he was trying to cover some dissidents in China. And one time he was invited to a place and roughed up physically by some guys who didn't like the articles he was writing. So that had a big impact on his thinking. It's not the way journalists should behave. And when Trump was looking for people who knew about China and who shared some of his conceptions, he drew on people like Matt Pottinger. I think the scholars in the United States who studied China want very much to return to better relations, very critical of the Trump administration. We hope that Biden will do better. And I am personally one of those who's writing articles now with some other scholars, trying to encourage a new administration, which we frankly hope will be the Biden administration, to have somewhat better relations. We aren't under the illusions that things are suddenly going to get better. They're not going to go back to the wonderful days of the 1980s when we had such good relations. But we hope to be reasonable competitors. In our view, we have to manage these difficulties. As you know, Americans are very complicated people with many different kinds, and we're often very divided. I'm happy to say that as a whole, Americans are quite open, and I hope that you found the relations are good. when I was asked by the Chinese Student Association at Harvard this year to give a speech, I gave a speech saying that we ought to be welcoming to the Chinese students and make them feel comfortable. One of my friends sent a copy of my speech to President Bacow of Harvard, and he wrote me a very nice note saying he agreed with that he wants us to be welcoming and to keep things open. And I had said in my letter, in my talk to the Chinese students, that as far as I knew, everyone I knew at Harvard was happy to have Chinese students here. And it was good for the university and wanted to be nice to them. And President Bacow wrote back in the note to me saying he found the same thing, that all the people he knew at Harvard were quite welcoming of Chinese students. Now, there may be individual problems that people run into, but I think as a whole, that's the attitude. So let me just conclude my talk by saying that I hope things will calm some under President Biden. I hope Biden wins, and that looks like reason for optimism now. And if he does, I think we can be somewhat more optimistic that things will not get out of hand. But as you know, there are a lot of Chinese who feel very confident now. We see some people we call wolf warrior diplomats who are being very tough. And there are some Americans who want to behave in the same way. But I think that there are also a lot of reasonable people on both sides. And I'm happy to say that even in these worst of times, when relations are so bad, there's still a lot of friends of mine who are having relations with colleagues in China and keeping those up. They're not advertising them, but they're going on because there are a lot of people on both sides who have very good relations. And I think of all of you as bridge builders. When I talked to the Chinese students at Harvard, I told them, some of you will stay, some of you will go back. I think whether you stay or whether you go back, you're a bridge builder because you understand both sides. And it's in our interest, it's in your interest, it's my personal interest to have very good bridges and make them work. So I'm sure your association is doing all you can to help in keeping those bridges open. So thank you very much. And I'll be happy to answer questions or make comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Vogel. That is very thought-provoking and very, very insightful. We do have a lot of questions coming in right now, but before I just read those questions, I just wanted to say I remembered one